Ideas have consequences. That's sort of an axiom. And there's a book about it written in the 1940s about how subscribing to certain ideas moves society one way or the other. But how big and far-reaching are these consequences? Well, for instance, the political ideas you subscribe to on the topic of sexual politics are a very good predictor on whether you'll reproduce or not. You know what else is a good predictor? The political ideas to which your government subscribes to. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so because I haven't done enough sexual politics videos lately, we'll recover some of that these days with these long videos. So, in another video we tackled the insane claim that men forming once again deep friendships with each other is apparently hurting women. That's an idea that has consequences. The consequences of that idea are less obvious because it takes a bit of foresight and also a bit of empathy for and with men, both qualities being in very short supply in militant gynocentric societies. But once we look to other factors too, the consequences become a lot more obvious. What other factors? Well, how about the current generation's attitude towards acceptable male behavior? Mind you, I would also look to a study on acceptable female behavior too, but nobody wants to study that as, in the current year, it is sexist and oppressive to even suggest that there is such thing as unacceptable female behavior. So The Economist published this very interesting table with data from the United Kingdom, Germany, Sweden, France, and the United States. What kind of data? Attitudes towards what I and more than 90% of people over the age of 50 consider to be normal behavior at best and no big deal at worst, depending on the question, but behavior that people under the age of 30 consider in various proportions to be unacceptable. The Economist writes about the graphics that you're looking at right now that, quote, during the past month, YouGov, a pollster, surveyed people in 5 Western countries about whether a series of behaviors by men towards women constitute sexual harassment. The questions ranged from actions that are often innocuous, such as asking to go for a drink, to overt demands for sex. The range of views was vast. One consistent pattern that emerged was a generation gap. In general, younger reports were more likely to think that a behavior crossed the line than their older peers were. For example, over half of British women under 30 said that wolf whistling was unacceptable. Less than a fifth over the age of 64 felt that way. Between men and women, differences of opinion emerged for specific questions. Both sexes tended to have similar views on whether a man who places his hand on a woman's lower back or comments on her attractiveness have gone too far. However, female respondents were much less tolerant of men looking at women's breasts than their male counterparts were. Among Americans 64 or older, for example, half of women but just a quarter of men say they would consider such ogling sexual harassment. A third source of variation was nationality. Swedish men, for example, seemed to feel entitled to make sexual jokes around women. Only a quarter of them said such behavior would be harassment. In contrast, 3/4 of American men expressed that opinion. Similarly, a quarter of French women under 30 believe that even asking to go for a drink is harassment, whereas almost none of their counterparts in Britain and Germany share that view. Now, I cannot help but wonder, what kind of French women did they ask? Did those French women happen to have names like Fatima, Benazir, or Daima? It's a serious question. Because if they did not ask predominantly Muslim women, then the idea that 1 in 4 French dateable women believe that even asking to go for a drink is not just inappropriate, but downright harassment, that is very bad news. It not just spells the effective end of what was for more than 2 centuries traditional for French women, but the effective end of French culture the way I got the privilege of knowing before this generation reached maturity. I still have two lady friends who no longer live in France, though, who I met by simply walking up to them and asking them to go have a coffee because it works well with the cigarette. Speaking of cigarettes, in France, the French government wants to forbid filmmakers from showing smokers in their movies. I'm not joking. I mean, socializing at a coffee shop while smoking a cigarette was the absolute norm in France for over a century. But now you'll soon not even be allowed the artistic freedom to show what most people know it to be true. Madness. Anyway, back to the graphs. Except the first two columns, the requesting a sexual favor and making sexual jokes, there is an indisputable and consistent variation by age. Without exception, the overwhelming majority of people over the age of 50 in all countries surveyed agree that wolf whistling is definitely not harassment. Because it isn't. It can be annoying maybe, but harassment? Get a grip. Just grow a thicker skin. Same with looking at breasts. The majority of people over the age of 50 in all countries surveyed believe, just like I do, that is definitely not harassment. You don't like people looking at your décolletage? Maybe you should dress more modestly, or learn not to make a big fuss about it. When you go out in the world, people are going to look at you. Just deal with it. Now, the optimistic way to read these graphs is to say that still a majority of even under 30s are still mostly normal, as I've seen some people reacting like that on social media. But that kind of optimism doesn't really hold water. If a quarter of under 30s, men or women, believe that a man asking to go for a drink is unacceptable behavior, then what else do they believe? And in what proportions? What do these ideas do to courtship and general dating? What are their effects to birth rates? You see, this is like economics. In economics, you can't really point out how many innovations, goods, and services are never created in the first place because of a stupid idea or regulations. You just know there will be quite a few. The same is true here. We don't know how many children are never born because of people being indoctrinated and they ended up believing insane things about human behavior. And things aren't even that bad in Europe or North America. At least if you compare with East Asia. In Japan, the government sponsors tons of dating events just so men and women can be in the same place outside of work and maybe fiddle with each other a little bit. Maybe they like it and have a baby. Or more babies, because Japan really needs those. In South Korea, the government forces young people to date with each other. Well, not all young people, just the students of the biggest universities, which now offer mandatory courses on dating, sex, love, and relationships that also include mandatory homework. What's the homework? You go on dates. Practice the lost art of forming healthy relationships. You know, just like my generation used to do, all by itself, without anybody telling them to do it, starting from the age of 13 or 14, oftentimes earlier. The policymakers just still don't get it. Now, oftentimes that's because they're clueless themselves, but sometimes it's because they have an incentive of their own not to get it. The official mantra is, economic pressures such as housing costs and unemployment and tuition fees. That's what they say in South Korea. Now, let me put it this way. In the 1960s, South Korea was poorer than North Korea. For some reason, those economic pressures did not stop the 1960s generation from giving birth to a generation that built up South Korea into the economic powerhouse that it is today. And the economic pressures were much higher then. I mean, rising tuition fees? Are you seriously going to expect me to believe that this is a legitimate issue? I mean, in the 1960s, having food available 3 days from now was one of the main economic pressure on South Korea. Yet somehow people worked it out without massive deaths from starvation, unlike North Korea. But that's a separate story altogether. The same is true in Europe, where economics is overemphasized and everything else ignored. Yes, of course economics matter, I made videos about that too, but to cite ridiculous things like rising tuition fees as reason for not dating at all, let alone having families and children, shows a fundamental lack of understanding of the world around you. I mean, in Korea, just like in most of Europe and most of North America, most people still don't go to college. And they shouldn't. Most college is bullshit anyway. Yet the birth rates continue to drop consistently. Any rational observer should thus be compelled to ponder that maybe, just maybe, it's not the tuition fee or the college attendance rate. Maybe it's something else. Something like, I don't know, the ideas that come from those universities, and the consequences of those ideas are really not inconsequential. For instance, there's a growing number of young people who bend over backwards to beat laws, regulations, and plain old common sense just to get themselves sterilized in their teenage years and early 20s. Now sure, some of them have legitimate reasons, such as the almost certainty that they would pass on serious genetic disorders to their offspring. Those are people worthy of compassion, not scorn, and definitely not a hedonistic movement like the so-called child-free movement. But the legitimate cases are a minority used to prop up this. Let me read you one example from this Vice article, and I do apologize in advance for quoting Vice, but the alternatives were far worse, trust me on that. So, it goes like this, quote, "For 28-year-old Andy who chooses not to identify as a specific gender and uses the pronoun they, the choice stems from something stronger. My mother was a really violent person and I was excommunicated from her at a young age," says Andy. "I'm scared of having kids and turning into her because motherhood was quite cruel thing for me. I wouldn't want my kids to go through the same experience." Andy was sterilized last year and says it's the best decision they've ever made. "It's massively improved my mental health and body dysphoria. No one ever stops people from having children, so why would you stop someone who doesn't want children? The stigma around simply not wanting children is huge, but it seems to be worse for women. There's societal pressures, sure, but a woman lacking any maternal instinct, that's a step too far for some. It's weird, heartless, and, well, outright selfish. For Andy, who was born a woman, other people felt as strongly about their decision to be sterilized as they did. People judge you, they explain. I've been back to hospital unrelated to my procedure, and female doctors have lectured me on something I've already had done. Andy believes this resistance is a symptom of defined gender roles. This idea that women have to settle down, get married, have children is quite a moral thing, isn't it? Life isn't just about reproduction. For me, it goes back to this patriarchal idea that gender is binary, and within that you have to comply with the set of normal roles. I'm very much against that. Becoming a parent isn't totally ruled out for Andy because, as they succinctly point out, there are other ways to have children that don't involve pushing them out through your uterus. Andy mentions adopting or co-parenting, where two or more people join forces for the sole reason of having a kid. What would they say to people who think 19 or even 29 is too young to make a decision so final that this is a narcissistic lifestyle choice designed to hold on to their not quite adult status? Caitlin assuredly disagrees. "I want time alone, time with my partner, and time to travel and spend money on luxury. I don't think there is anything wrong with that," she says. "My generation live in a broken world. We come from broken homes and have broken minds and bodies. Many of us just don't want to reproduce. It's my life, and I'm not hurting anyone." Close quote. Now, sure, a cynic would say, maybe it's a good thing that these people won't reproduce, and I'm not sure I would disagree. But for the purposes of this talk, let's look again to these portions. My mother was a really violent person and I was excommunicated from her at a young age, says Andy. I'm scared of having kids and turning into her. Motherhood was quite cruel for me. And also this portion. My generation live in a broken world. We come from broken homes and even broken minds, and we have broken bodies. Many of us just don't want to reproduce. Close quote. Now, how did that happen? Because the way I see it, that situation is the logical conclusion of militant feminism first and foremost, and in general the extreme augmentation of pre-existent gynocentric worldviews. In the 1800s and way into the 1990s in my neck of the woods, mothers like Andy's mother would have been themselves cast out of the community and branded as unnatural mothers. Well, I don't think there is a word in English for the Romanian word denaturat. There is in French, dénaturé. When applied to people, parents in particular, it basically means someone who is a natural, i.e. a biological parent, but by his or her actions, he or she was stripped of their natural rights and privileges of that status. So it's a bit different than unnatural in English. I noticed that the term mamă denaturată kind of disappeared lately in my country. I'm a bit worried about that, because when I was growing up, talking honestly about both fathers and mothers, whom the community deemed to be unnatural, was very common. Mind you, the standards were also pretty high. I mean, a petty spank or some yelling was nowhere near enough. But serious and harsh abuse to the extent described by Andy, for sure. But most of that is gone in most of Europe, and the process was much more brutal because of feminism. Now, I would recommend you read Erin Pizzey's books on how feminists effectively silenced her back in the 1970s for her audacity to prove that women can be, and indeed are, much more often than many dare to think, just as violent and messed up in their families as men can be. The disappearance from public and community discourse of ideas known to be true that have had passed the test of time, and their replacement with completely false and, yes, unnatural ideas, that was not a natural evolution. It was superimposed. It was a consequence of militantism for bad ideas. And now everyone reaps the results, the consequences, including those of us on the non-left, albeit we are less affected than those entirely immersed into the culture of bad ideas, which has been mainstream for far too long. That is why the culture war mentality matters, because ideas really do have consequences. But teenagers and young adults wanting to get permanently sterilized is not the only consequence, not even by a long shot. There are a few others. For instance, in late August 2018, there will be a festival in Gothenburg, Sweden, called the Banana Spirits, or Bananpirren på svenska, which will forbid men's participation. That's right, folks, sex segregation in public events is back. Now, that wouldn't be such a bad thing if it weren't for all the wrong reasons and for all the double standards, because let's dial back on why this is happening. This festival is organized because there have been several rapes and multiple sexual assaults and legit harassment in previous festivals held in the last 2 years in Sweden. Admitting that the overwhelming majority of the perpetrators were of a certain ethnic background and followers of a certain religion, admitting that is forbidden. So instead we're now blaming all men and exclude them from public events. Well, not we, but the organizer of that event, who just by pure coincidence happens to be a militant misandrist feminist. Ideas have consequences. The idea that complete and open borders is a sound policy has consequences. The idea that you can shred to pieces the old social contract without replacing it with something at least as sound as the one you just destroyed also has consequences, especially in the realm of sexual politics. And the future doesn't look particularly bright either, unless we, the wide non-feminist majority, finally get around to winning the cultural war. And I'm optimistic on that front. I think we will win. The problem is that by the time we win, those who are born right now or were born after, let's say, 2010 or 2012, they will still have gotten to grow up under the current norms. In plainer language, we might have another generation of sacrifice on our hands. That is why I so harshly advocate for building private networks right now, precisely to save as many as possible. Because the kids of today, and I mean kids, not teenagers, those are eating red pills by the tons as we speak. And that's great. But the kids, those aged 7 or younger, are being raised in the moments of the peak of the power of social justice warriors and militant misandrists. More and more schools all over the former Western Bloc are literally banning kids from making best friends. We'll explain more of that in other videos, but still, the most basic thing that all of us who are adults now learned in our first formative years, that is now forbidden. Because making best friends is one of the experiences by which you learn valuable things, such as not all people are equal and thus don't deserve to be treated equally. Also, you'll learn conflict management and set the foundation for the ability to build strong relationships in the future. Millions of kids are right now robbed from that formative experience. Girls in the United States are being advised not to hug their relatives. If you think that is not going to have consequences, you're not just overly optimistic, but also wrong. Sure, most of this madness will be gone by 2040, but by that time it will have already been too late for the kids of today, and the consequences won't be pretty. Oh well, don't get me started on shoving down transgenderism down the throats of children in Scandinavia. More on that in upcoming videos, but it is truly horrific. Teaching 3-year-olds that a horse can identify as a dog? If you think that's not going to have consequences, you are seriously underestimating the gravity of the situation. And it goes on and on and on. That's why I'm not optimistic for the short run, and that's why I'm trying to transmit a sense of urgency, even if I do it in a more or in a less dramatic way, I guess I should say. But the reason local agitprop is needed is precisely to prevent further damage from being done. Because the ideas being pushed down the throats of these kids are even worse than what we've seen so far. You think now it's bad? Wait until a huge contingent of 20-year-olds who think a horse can literally be and become a dog. If you think those 20-year-olds will be keen on reproduction and upholding civilization, I have a bridge to sell to you. So, let's wrap this up with what we started. Ideas have consequences. And the consequences of an idea often are far-reaching, even if that idea does not become government policy. We are now at a moment when plenty of very, very bad and deeply destructive ideas are government policy. And while changing the policies is a laborious and very much needed process, sheltering oneself in the meantime is also a much needed practice. There are basically two mentalities at play in this kind of work, and both are needed. There's the researcher mentality, and then there's the doctor mentality. The doctor mentality is that every patient matters and needs to be saved. In practical politics, these are each and every one of you combating bad ideas wherever you meet them. Attending PTA meetings and preventing retarding nonsense from ending up in the curricula of your child, writing complaints against airports to switch off CNN, and all the rest of the ideas given in previous videos and more to come in future videos. The researcher mentality, on the other hand, is that while it's sad that 10,000 patients will die in the meantime, what needs to be done in order to prevent the death of 1 billion. That's basically the work that I do. I'm very aware that many children and young people will not be able to escape this, and I'm very sorry for them, but I'm also very aware that if people like me don't exist to propagate bigger, better, and more influential views, then a lot more than those 10,000 people will suffer. This channel morphed into a channel for activists in a way, and that's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's great when I see the exact argument, almost word for word, being made in places I expect the least to encounter. That means more people hear about it without connecting it to this channel, which is good, because I'm not in this for the fame and clicks, but for the ideas, for the research. Mind you, sometimes you can be both. I know I was for many years, but the point is that both mentalities are needed, and if we don't internalize this sense of urgency on these matters, the consequences of what's coming will be harsher. Yes, I know, I'm not ending in a cheerful manner. But then again, you don't come to Freedom Alternative for unconstrained kumbaya visions, but for the tragic vision, which starts with the realization that humans are flawed. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do subscribe to my social media, links in the low bar. Maybe consider throwing a shekel, because these videos take a lot of time to make. And I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.